Want to do better? Then it's time to change the story. Welcome to our show about new visions currently transforming the world through the confluence of art, tech, and innovation. And now your hosts, Michael Ashley and Neil Sahota.
Hey, welcome to another episode of Changing the Story. We've got a phenomenal guest today, Marinela Gombosev. She is the CEO of Evoke Neuroscience, a data and diagnostics company focused on reducing the number of people living with treatable cognitive impairment. Over 58,000 patients have been scanned using Evoke's technology. The company has twice been ranked in Inc.'s 500 and 5,000 fastest growing private companies. She earned her bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from the University of California, Irvine, all right, and MBA from Pepperdine University, where she was named top 40 under 40 alumna. Marinela, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. So as a visionary, what is the story that you would like to bring to the world?
So I'd like people to know that it is high time that we start taking good care and proactive care of our brains. This is something that, is not really well covered in our healthcare system. We go to our doctor, we get everything checked, we get our blood drawn, we can get our chest x-rayed, we can, do all sorts of diagnostic tests, but when was the last time your doctor checked how well your brain was working? So this is there needs to be a paradigm shift in how we approach taking care of our brains, both from a healthcare perspective, but also from a patient and consumer perspective. The way we think about our brain needs to be a lot more like the heart. We don't show up to our doctor and say, hey, I had a heart attack. What do I do now? In fact, we take proactive care of our heart. Even our Cheerios box says this is heart healthy. So the big idea that I want to share is that we can and we should take better and proactive care of our brains.
Well, I would say that I, at least, maybe some of our audience would go like, whoa, maybe I don't really know how well my brain is doing. Maybe it's not full enough, I don't know. But we always seem to discount or realize too late that we might be having mental health issues. I think with COVID-19 going on, there's a lot more anxiety and stress, and I'm seeing a lot of PTSD from people. I mean, how do we even know if we're having like mental health or brain trauma going on?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I think it's important to understand that the brain is responsible for what some people may think are kind of the conditions that we term as mental health, such as depression, anxiety, PTSD. Those are not things that are just happening to you, and they're often very stigmatized. So first and foremost, it's important to recognize that those are actually a result of physical changes in your brain, electrochemical changes that manifest themselves as depression or anxiety or, suicidal ideation. So that first has to be dispelled, that myth that, what's wrong with me? It's an actual change in your physiology. And then, on the other side of the spectrum, from away from mental health, talking a little bit about neurodegenerative disease, such as Alzheimer's and dementia, two very scary conditions, dementia being the umbrella condition. Also recognizing that that is not a normal way to age, but it's also something that we can influence. Research now shows that 1 out of 3 dementia cases could be prevented or delayed. So that's very powerful information that we can take in and start to take some actions.
I want to pick up on what you said there about things that we can do something about, we can change, and talk about the performance issue. So I've often heard that a big thing that you can do to prepare as you get older is to do things like crossword puzzles to keep your brain engaged. In the same way, going back to what you mentioned about the heart, people take walks, they do physical exercise so that they keep their heart going well, their physical health. In the same way, when it comes to mental health, I even began doing apps a few years ago to engage and to work on things like short-term memory, awareness, stuff like that. What recommendations would you make for, even for people that are much younger, they're not even close to an age where this is going to be an issue? How can people begin being proactive even from a young age, and what would you recommend doing?
Yeah, such a great question. Well, first and foremost, I'm not a neuroscientist and I'm not a medical doctor, but I have come to learn through our work at Evoke Neuroscience in looking at the research and in looking at what's information is available to us. It really is about reducing those risk factors to the brain. When you look at the latest research published by the Alzheimer's Association, they put out a list of risk factors starting at early age that we can work to reduce in order to age in a healthy way. So in particular for Alzheimer's and other types of dementia, starting with that higher education early in life, getting a exposure to more and more education builds up cognitive reserve, which is then used later in life as a protective factor. Later in life and in midlife, we want to look at things like hearing loss and hypertension and obesity. And then much later in life, and actually throughout our entire lives, it's the effects of exercise and diet have been demonstrated to have protective effects against neurodegenerative disease. So I would encourage everybody just to do a little bit of digging and research on your own to see what would make a difference in your life. And the bottom line is basically anything that's good for the heart is most likely also good for the brain. So you can keep it simple that way.
Sure. Well, there's one quick follow-up question on that. So I'd also heard, Woody Allen makes a joke about this in Annie Hall, talking about the importance of continuing education. So as you mentioned, that's interesting about doing higher education when you're young. Would you also then recommend people take courses as they get older, just to stay engaged and things like that?
The research, there are some studies that show that cognitive training as part of other lifestyle interventions does have these protective effects, reducing your risk and also delaying the onset of cognitive decline. So yes, I don't know necessarily whether crossword puzzles do it or Sudoku or more rigorous forms of cognitive training. But I think keeping your mind engaged and always learning is absolutely a good thing.
Kind of building upon Michael's exercise, it sounds like, based on what you said earlier, that while we feel mental health issues, it's actually damaging our brain. So we're actually some sort of physical damage to us. Did I understand that right?
Yeah, there's actual physiological changes that manifest in the brains of people with anxiety, with depression, with PTSD. And there are very distinct patterns of the brain that can be recognized. And that's what we do as a company, is we provide analytics to physicians who are using our product to help them understand what changes are happening in the brain so they can better understand the underlying causes of the patient's symptoms. So yes, absolutely. These are changes that basically light up in the brain in various regions.
Can we heal those? I mean, if I'm feeling anxious, am I permanently damage myself here?
Yeah, I mean, our brains are kind of amazing in the sense that we can be highly functioning individuals and still have a lot of issues with our brains. But what happens over time is that those challenges that the brain is overcoming on a day-to-day basis in order to perform, they wear on us and they wear our brain down, and they can show up later in life as well, even though we are high functioning adults. So yes, they can be corrected. Of course, there are lots of medications for anxiety, for depression. They can correct some of the chemical imbalances that are going on, but there are also alternative therapies, for anxiety. A lot of our practitioners use heart rate variability, biofeedback, and other alternative therapies. So regardless of the treatment, whether it's a more conventional or more alternative method, you can make those changes in the brain.
It reminds me of a TED Talk I saw a few years ago that would talk about the elasticity of the brain. And what you mentioned is that we were told for a long time that if you do things like, let's say, drinking, you kill brain cells and they don't come back. but it sounded like that determination had been reversed, that there is elasticity to the brain. And to Neil's question, I would go even further. Is that, number one, is my understanding correct? And number two, what are some, let's say, proactive measures as well? Let's say that you are dealing with anxiety, especially in these times. What could you do to mitigate the bad effects of that, so that you stay brain healthy?
Yeah. So to that second question, there's a lot of information out there about how to address anxiety. There is no magic pill. I think we're all feeling some level of anxiety as a result of COVID and social unrest, and there's a lot going on in the world right now. The various pressures that people are feeling, whether it be financial or otherwise. So, to me, just going back to personally, like recognizing that that's a fact in your life and acknowledging that first. And then also recognizing that there are steps that you can take to address that. Whether it's, talking to your medical provider as a first step and getting a diagnosis, that can often be helpful in kind of the first step. But also looking at other tools that, I personally don't like taking medication. So I'm going to try everything I can do to avoid taking medications. And of course, I will take medications if I need to. So I did mention heart rate variability biofeedback. That's been, studied as a alternative therapy for kind of managing your body's physiological response to stressors. So that's one thing that people could look at.
Yeah.
So Marinela, I mean, you and Evoke Science are kind of leading this charge on like the mental health and taking care of the brain. I mean, why hasn't it gotten more attention before? I mean, what are the challenges involved here?
Yeah, I mean, some of the challenges relate to the way our healthcare system is set up in terms of who owns this kind of process. It's not historically, primary care providers have not had a lot of tools at their disposal to deal with mental health, and we do have quite a shortage of mental health providers in the U.S. And I think it's also societal. I mean, if you look at past generations, we haven't wanted to talk about mental health. It's been a very stigmatized issue, and it's something that a lot of folks brush aside and want to power through. And so I'm actually very encouraged to kind of where we're heading with this, because COVID has created such an opportunity for us to pause and reflect and see how much that mental health does affect our lives. And I'm also encouraged by the fact that Gen Z, as well as millennial generations, are very willing to talk about mental health and well-being. And they have the potential to become advocates of this cause in the coming years and generations. So I think this is a significant point in time that brings a lot of needed attention to this issue.
Neil and I had a guest on yesterday, and he was talking about the need to not be in a reactive mode and the importance of taking a step back and going to things that allow for greater contemplation, so that you don't just lash out at somebody, especially when it comes to social media. So I wonder, and we were talking about meditation as a tool to lead us to getting away from that reactivity. And I wondered what your thoughts were about meditation in terms of overall brain health. And then knowing that mindfulness is very much in the news these days, how too can mindfulness be another tool that we use?
Yeah. Well, meditation has been demonstrated to cause physiological changes in the brain that can be both lasting and in the moment. So I think that is absolutely a good tool to look at. It does take commitment and practice, but it has been demonstrated to literally make those changes, those healthy changes in the brain that we discussed. So yeah, I'm personally a fan. I try to meditate as often as I can. It doesn't always happen, but yeah, I agree. Yeah.
And mindfulness, would you say people? I have a friend that very much is devoted to the mindfulness practice. What would you say about that too?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it goes hand in hand. I mean, I think it's just being in having a state of awareness about your own mindset, and your mental health is a direct result of that. Yes, there can be electrochemical changes in the brain that are outside of our control, but it does start with our own thoughts and actions, and how we proactively protect and address those thoughts.
If I could maybe change gears for a bit here, because I know we were talking about like brain health and, you know, mental health, but if I understand some of the work that Evoke is doing, there's actually triggers for other diseases like cardiovascular diseases where there's actually an impact on the brain. You could actually perhaps detect some of those risk factors from actually like brain imaging. Is that my way off base here, or?
No, I think what you're picking up on is the fact that at Evoke, we also measure, besides measuring EEG to look at brain health, we also measure the autonomic nervous system through a 3-lead ECG. So that gives us a little window into the autonomic nervous system, which controls basically our fight or flight response, which is very much linked to anxiety, depression, PTSD. So really, as a company, we focus on metrics that are both central nervous system and autonomic nervous system related.
So it's more than brain, it's actually brain and body to some degree.
Yeah, and those two systems are very much linked. So when you talk about mindfulness, it's, you know, mindfulness is aware, includes awareness of our bodies, our state of mind, and it's very much a whole system that interacts in order to create the experiences that we have every day.
So when you said, it reminds me, this whole conversation reminds me, I was in a meeting a couple of years ago, and I forgot the name of the movie that came out. It was about what happens to football players who get in all these head injuries. And we were sitting around the table, all these professionals, and we were debating. It was a group of people that were about middle-aged or so, about whether or not they would ever let their kids play football. And so I think that has definitely, the culture has changed in the last few decades about this issue. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that, first of all. And also, what are maybe some other things, other activities that maybe we take for granted that can be contributing to problems when it comes to brain health, and then knowing that brain health affects body health?
So I'll address that one first, the last one first. Hearing loss, as I mentioned earlier, is a huge risk factor. I wouldn't say huge, is a risk factor for Alzheimer's and dementia. And so if we think about, you know, in our young lives when we're listening to a lot of loud music and damaging that eardrum, or we maybe work in a highly noisy environment and some of those, maybe in a construction zone, or, you know, you work at an airport and you're exposed to that high levels of noise all the time, that can become a risk factor for Alzheimer's. So protecting your hearing system, your auditory system, is important. As far as football is concerned, you know, I'm so glad you bring that up. That is absolutely a risk factor for a variety of brain-based disorders. We know that now. We also, at our company, we have been part of studies that have looked at soccer players. So not necessarily the high impact sports, but what's called a subconcussive blow, a repeated non-concussion, but a repeated blow to the head from headers in soccer. And those physiological changes to the brain can be measured. So you are in fact creating damage as you expose your brain to physical impact. How much and what that causes down the road, you know, we don't know yet. It hasn't been answered. But as for me, I know my son will not be playing football. And certainly I'll be looking closely at soccer as well. I know that they also stopped, they don't allow kids to do headers for some of those exact reasons. So yeah, it's absolutely something we should be aware of as parents. And, you know, I'm a football fan as much as the next person, but it's a fact that the brain does get damaged from impact.
Sure.
I remember watching, I don't know if it's the same movie, Michael, the movie Concussion with Will Smith, which I thought was really, really well done. And I actually thought it was interesting because they talk about your brain is kind of floating in this liquid, right? You know, I know there's not a whole lot of space there, but if you're suddenly running and there's an impact, your brain is essentially hitting against your skull and getting bruised. And, you know, dumb us, or at least dumb me, we never think twice about some of those things. But I can tell you, I've actually suffered a concussion, and all I remember was running, and next thing I know, I'm on the sidelines, and the coach had told me that you'd been out for like a couple of minutes.
Wow.
Right? And to me, it's like I didn't really experience that, right? I believe them, but it's kind of hard to resonate. And I know that people really get it, like that immediate threat, but it sounds like when it comes to like neurological conditions and brain health, it might be a slow, long-term type of play. So I mean, how do people stay on top of that and make sure that we're doing some of the right things and we're staying healthy in that regard?
Yeah, I think that's a big, important question. I mean, it starts with awareness. You have to be aware that only you can protect your brain, right? And what are the ways that you can protect your brain? It'll be wonderful when our healthcare system does ultimately take a preventive approach, and I think that will happen. In fact, the American Association of Neurology issued a recommendation that everybody over the age of 65 should be getting an annual cognitive screening. That's a good start, right? But it's not nearly as far as we should be going. As you mentioned, concussion can happen to anybody, right? And at any age. So we need to be monitoring what's happening from a brain health perspective.
Out of curiosity, so what does a cognitive exam look like? What kind of questions are you covering on that?
Yeah, so the Academy does not make any specific recommendations, so it leaves that up to the practitioner. But for our assessment, we have a battery of tests that are both subjective, meaning they ask the patient for information to get an inventory of what they're experiencing. But we also measure the brain objectively using EEG. And so while EEG historically has only been used in limited cases such as epilepsy, EEG also contains a lot of rich data, a lot of rich electrophysiological biomarkers, or biomarkers for short, that give us insight into a variety of disease states, including depression, dementia, anxiety, PTSD, ADHD. And those can be very useful to doctors when they're looking at what a patient's going through. So EEG has the ability basically to measure function. How well is your brain working, as opposed to something like MRI, which looks at structure.
Yeah.
It sounds really comprehensive. I'm just curious for my own personal use here. My better half, she's always telling me, like, what, are you crazy? Does this help certify that I'm not crazy?
Yeah, we'd have to see if you are.
That doesn't sound like a regular endorsement.
So for our listeners, any closing thoughts, recommendations, thoughts that you have about how people, especially they want to be proactive, they want to take care of this stuff, even if they are suffering decline right now, what could they do?
Yeah, I mean, for one, they can go to our website. It would be the evoxbrainmap.com to learn a little bit more about various conditions that can manifest in the brain. We also have a physician finder there where they can check out a local doctor to help them find somebody who could take a look at their brain with our device. But even if not, if they're not curious about getting a scan, I would just look at, start doing a little bit of research and think about your own history. Have you had concussions? Have you been in car accidents? And what are things that you can do, even in incremental ways, to keep your brain engaged? And, what's good for the heart is good for the brain.
Sure.
Fantastic. With that, I guess we'll put all that information in the show notes for our audience, assuming I don't get certified. Sounds like I probably need to schedule a test with you, Marinela.
Yeah, we'll make that happen.
But I appreciate you. I think we all appreciate you sharing your story here. And, I think it's definitely opened my eyes about, I got to take better care of my brain.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Marinela.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Hey, if you like today's show, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment.
If you've been enjoying the Changing the Story podcast series, please subscribe
and share it with your friends.
Thank you.